There is a mansion 25 miles north of New York City that has absorbed more secrets than any vault on Wall Street. Kykuit sits on the highest point in Pocantico Hills, wrapped in 3,500 acres of manicured isolation, overlooking the Hudson River. The Dutch word means lookout. The 40-room estate was built for looking out, watching, controlling everything below. It was home to 4 generations of Rockefellers, the family that owned Standard Oil and, for a time, owned America itself. When it opened in 1913, John D Rockefeller was the richest man in history. His fortune equaled 3% of the nation's entire economy. No American wealth since has come close. The mansion became the throne room of an American dynasty, the place where heirs were groomed and broken, where art worth billions concealed basement passages filled with darker collections, where family members disappeared and died under circumstances the walls would never explain. For more than a century, the Rockefellers controlled their image with the same ruthlessness they controlled oil prices. But buildings remember what families forget. This is the story of Kykuit, where America learned the cost of dynasty. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to see what really happened behind the gates of American power, subscribe now and drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. Because what happened at Kykuit didn't just shape one family, it shaped the country you're living in right now. Chapter 1. The Empty Hilltop. In 1893, the stretch of land that became Kykuit was nothing. Dirt roads cut through abandoned farms where crops had once grown for the estates that sprawled across the Hudson Valley. The occasional oak tree offered shade to deer and foxes. New York City proper ended miles to the south. The Gilded Age existed there in marble mansions and opera houses. But here in Pocantico Hills, there was only elevation and the view it commanded. One man saw something different in that emptiness. John D Rockefeller had come to Standard Oil in 1870, when petroleum meant kerosene for lamps and little else. By 1893, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining. His company was the first true monopoly, the template every trust followed. He had crushed competitors, negotiated secret railroad rebates, and built an empire so vast that federal prosecutors were already preparing the cases that eventually broke it apart. But Standard Oil made him rich beyond measurement. His fortune approached $900 million, nearly 3% of the entire United States gross domestic product. He was 54 years old. He was exhausted. Rockefeller purchased 400 acres in Pocantico Hills for reasons he never fully explained. The land sat on the highest elevation for miles, offering panoramic views of the Hudson River and the Palisades beyond. It was far enough from Manhattan to discourage casual visitors, but close enough to reach by private rail car. The location was strategic. From this hilltop, you could see anyone approaching long before they arrived. He told associates he wanted a simple country house where his family could gather, a place for his wife Laura and their 5 children. Somewhere to rest between the pressures of managing the largest corporation in America and defending it from prosecutors, journalists, and Congress. He had other homes, a Manhattan brownstone, an estate in Cleveland, but those felt exposed. Here, on this hilltop that the Dutch settlers had called Kykuit, he could build something no one could touch. He moved his family into a house already on the property, the Parsons Wentworth house, while he planned. They spent weekends there, summer weeks, falls, when the leaves turned. Laura Rockefeller, devout Baptist and devoted mother, liked the peace. Their children, now adults, visited with increasing frequency as Standard Oil's public reputation darkened. The mansion was a refuge in name and became one in fact. But on September 17, 1902, the Parsons Wentworth house burned to the ground. Rockefeller had never been satisfied with the electrical wiring. The installation had been completed before certain safety measures were developed, and he had ordered workers to reroute everything into conduits. The work was scheduled to begin the day after the fire. The loss was estimated at $40,000, equivalent to roughly $1.2 million today. The family moved to another house on the property, the Kent House, and Rockefeller accelerated his plans. He began building the mansion he had been imagining. By 1900, the estate had expanded to more than 2,000 acres. By the time he was finished, it exceeded 3,500. Buying anything was simple for Rockefeller. Buying invisibility proved far more valuable. Chapter 2. The Oil King. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, the second of 6 children. His father was a traveling salesman who was frequently absent. His mother, Eliza, raised the children with strict Baptist discipline and modest expectations. The family moved often, arriving in Cleveland, Ohio in 1853 when John was 14. He attended high school briefly, took a single business class at a commercial college, and at 16 became an assistant bookkeeper, earning 50 cents per day. He was good with numbers, better with people. In 1859, at age 20, Rockefeller formed a partnership in the commission business with Morris B. Clark. They dealt in hay, grain, meats, and other goods, and the enterprise prospered immediately. That same year, the first oil well was drilled at Titusville in western Pennsylvania, giving birth to the petroleum industry. Cleveland, connected by rail to the oil fields, became a major refining center. In 1863, Rockefeller and Clark entered the oil business as refiners. Within 2 years, Rockefeller had bought out Clark for $72,500 and formed Rockefeller and Andrews with the chemist Samuel Andrews. On January 10, 1870, Rockefeller incorporated the Standard Oil Company with $1 million in capital. Of the initial 10,000 shares, he received 2,667. It was enough. Standard Oil succeeded through relentless cost-cutting and efficiency improvements. Rockefeller understood that controlling transportation meant controlling the industry. He negotiated rebates with railroads based on volume, receiving rates his competitors could not match. When smaller refiners screamed about discrimination, railroad executives noted that anyone providing the same shipping volume received the same discount. No one else could. By 1872, Standard Oil controlled nearly all the refineries in Cleveland. The price of kerosene dropped from 58 cents per gallon in 1865 to 8 cents by the 1880s. Millions of Americans illuminated their homes with Standard Oil at 1 cent per hour. In doing so, they made Rockefeller the wealthiest man in American history. His methods attracted criticism. Author Ida Tarbell, whose father had been driven out of the oil business, wrote exposés portraying Rockefeller as ruthless and unscrupulous. Critics called him a robber baron who crushed competitors, bribed officials, and built his fortune on the ruins of other men. The accusations were not entirely wrong. Rockefeller had indeed bought out competitors aggressively. He had negotiated secret agreements. He had created the first major trust in American history, placing the stock of Standard Oil and its affiliates under the control of a board of 9 trustees with himself at the head. The structure evaded state laws prohibiting companies from holding stock in out-of-state corporations. Other monopolies copied the model. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining and pipelines. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal legislation prohibiting trusts and combinations that restrain trade. The Ohio Supreme Court dissolved the Standard Oil Trust in 1892. Rockefeller simply transferred the properties to companies in other states with interlocking directorates. The same 9 men controlled operations. In 1899, the companies were formed as Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, a holding company that functioned until 1911, when the United States Supreme Court ruled it in violation of antitrust laws and ordered it dismantled. Standard Oil was broken into 34 separate entities, including companies that became ExxonMobil and Chevron Corporation. The breakup made Rockefeller richer. He owned a quarter of the shares in the new companies, and their values mostly doubled. His wealth peaked at approximately $900 million in 1913, equivalent to roughly $23.5 billion in modern currency. But the more meaningful figure is the percentage. His fortune represented nearly 3% of the United States' gross domestic product. As a proportion of the national economy, no American fortune since has approached it. He married Laura Celestia Spellman, a schoolteacher, on September 8, 1864, in Cleveland. They had 5 children: Bessie, Alice, who died in infancy, Alta, Edith, and John Jr., born January 29, 1874. To his children, Rockefeller was the man who played games with gusto, balanced plates on his nose, and taught them to swim and ride bicycles. But from the world, he kept his distance. He was a target for fortune hunters and frauds. Hundreds of letters requesting money arrived each week. In 1896, at age 57, Rockefeller retired from daily management of Standard Oil. He had given shares of his income to charity since childhood, and now he focused on giving away the bulk of his fortune. He donated more than $500 million during his lifetime, funding the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, and countless other institutions. A Baptist minister he hired to advise him on philanthropy warned that his fortune was rolling up like an avalanche, that he must distribute it faster than it grew, or it would crush him and his children. Rockefeller worked himself nearly to a nervous breakdown trying. An empire proves easier to build than to dismantle. Chapter 3. Building the fortress construction of Kykuit began in 1905 under the supervision of John D Rockefeller Jr. Sr. wanted a simple house. Jr. wanted a statement. The tension between those visions defined the project and eventually the family. Jr. hired the landscape architecture firm Olmsted Brothers to design the grounds. Frederick Law Olmsted had created Central Park and dozens of the nation's most celebrated landscapes. His firm should have been the obvious choice. Rockefeller Sr. was unhappy with their work. He fired them and took over the landscape design himself, transplanting whole mature trees, creating scenic winding roads, and positioning lookouts across the hilltop. When you are accustomed to directing the largest corporation in America, gardens present no particular challenge. For the house itself, Jr. hired Chester Holmes Aldrich and William Adams Delano, architects trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition. Aldrich was a distant relative of Abby Aldrich, the woman Jr. later married. The architects designed a three-story mansion in an eclectic mix of styles, neither imposing nor particularly distinguished. Construction took 6 years. In 1906, the project was threatened by a shortage of structural steel. Jr. contacted the President of United States Steel Corporation directly. The shortage ended. The house was completed in 1908. Laura Spelman Rockefeller did not like it. She did not explain her objections in detail. Perhaps the design lacked coherence. Perhaps she found it too modest for a family of their stature, or too grand for her Baptist sensibilities. Whatever the reason, her disapproval was absolute. Jr., who had overseen every detail of heating, plumbing, and appliances, began planning a complete rebuild. He hired William Wells Bosworth, who had been working on the garden design, to redesign the house itself. Bosworth had studied at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the École des Beaux-Arts. He had worked on the restoration of the Palace of Versailles and Notre Dame de Reims, projects partially funded by Rockefeller money. Bosworth transformed the house. The new design featured 4 stories of locally quarried rough-cut fieldstone and Indiana limestone in a classical revival style. The structure contained 40 rooms arranged around 2 basement levels filled with interconnecting passageways and service tunnels. The architecture suggested both grandeur and secrecy. You could move through the house without being seen. The gardens mattered more than the house. Bosworth designed dramatic hilltop terraces and formal gardens with pavilions, grottos, fountains, and classical sculpture in the Beaux-Arts and Italianate styles. The Oceanus fountain, commissioned in 1913, was a replica of a fountain created in 1576 for the Boboli Gardens of Florence. Date palms were imported from Egypt, banana trees from Central America, birds of paradise from South Africa. The exotic vegetation had no business surviving in a semi-arid climate. Constant irrigation from wells drilled deep into the aquifer made survival possible. The gardens had been budgeted at $30,000. They cost $1,030,000. They took 7 years to complete. From 1908 to 1915, the gardens cost more than the mansion itself. Bosworth's work at Kykuit is considered his finest achievement in the United States. The mansion was completed in 1913. The fortress stood ready. The family that occupied it was not. Chapter 4. The Heirs' Burden. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was the only son of the wealthiest man in history. He was also his opposite. Where Sr. projected confidence and strategic vision, Jr. exhibited caution and psychological fragility. He was deeply reserved, painfully shy and burdened by expectations he could not articulate, but could not escape. His father had conquered an industry. Junior spent his life managing the aftermath. In the fall of 1894, at a Providence home, Junior met Abby Aldrich. She was the daughter of Nelson Wilmarth Aldrich, a powerful Republican senator from Rhode Island. Abby was buoyant, impulsive, outgoing, everything the Rockefellers were not. The Aldriches were lively and irreverent. The Rockefellers were pious, reserved, and cautious. Junior fell in love immediately and spent the next 7 years gathering the confidence to propose. They married on October 9, 1901, in what newspapers called the consummate marriage of capitalism and politics. The wedding at the Aldrich estate in Warwick Neck was among the most lavish of the Gilded Age, attended by Standard Oil executives and political power brokers. The marriage was a lifelong love affair marked by profound strain. Junior adored Abby. He sought her counsel on every significant decision. He supported her involvement in the Young Women's Christian Association, her art collecting, and eventually her role as a founder of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. But he resented the demands their 6 children and society made on her time. His jealousy was almost obsessive. Abby learned to handle his resentment, though biographers note it came at considerable personal cost. They had 6 children. Abby, called Babs, was born in 1903. John III arrived in 1906, Nelson in 1908, Lawrence in 1910, Winthrop in 1912, and David in 1915. Abby raised them with a commitment to public service and modern thinking that transformed the family. She softened the Rockefellers' rigidity and helped them embrace a changing world. Junior supported her efforts while privately struggling with his own psychological imprisonment. His most visible failure came in 1914 during the Colorado Coalfield War. Junior, who had assumed control of many family business interests, was widely blamed for orchestrating the Ludlow massacre, in which National Guard troops attacked striking coal miners and their families. The assault killed workers, women, and children. The deaths stained Junior's reputation for decades. He spent years developing industrial relations programs to repair the damage, but the episode revealed a ruthlessness he inherited. Despite his temperamental differences from his father, Junior managed the Rockefeller fortune with dutiful precision. He funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, beginning in 1927. He financed the construction of Rockefeller Center during the Great Depression. He gave away hundreds of millions of dollars to universities, hospitals, and churches. He did everything expected of him and more. Abby, meanwhile, pursued her passion for modern and folk art, eventually amassing a collection that helped define American cultural institutions. The woman who married into the nation's most conservative family became one of its great progressive forces. Abby died of a heart attack on April 5, 1948, at the family's apartment at 740 Park Avenue. She was 73. Junior remarried in 1951 to Martha Baird, the widow of a college classmate, but the loss of Abby marked the end of the family's cohesive center. The 5 brothers, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, were grown men with their own ambitions. Their father had taught them duty. Their mother had taught them possibility. Each brother bore the weight of reconciling those lessons differently. Chapter 5. The Gilded prison John D Rockefeller Sr. moved into Kykuit in 1913 at age 74. He lived there, seasonally at first and then more permanently, until his death in 1937. During those years, the estate functioned as something between a fortress and a village. At its peak, the property contained 75 houses and 70 private roads, most designed by Rockefeller Sr. and Jr. The estate maintained its own farming operations, cattle, and food supplies. Security guards, gardeners, and laborers formed a resident workforce whose size was never publicly disclosed, but was substantial enough to support complete self-sufficiency. The infrastructure rivaled small municipalities. A 9-hole reversible golf course had been designed in 1901 by Willie Dunn, the architect of Shinnecock Hills Golf Club. Wells supplied water for the exotic gardens that required constant irrigation. The roads wound through the property in patterns designed to maximize scenic views while controlling access. From certain vantage points, you could see approaching visitors miles before they reached the house. The Rockefellers valued privacy the way other families valued connection. Senior's daily life at Kykuit was simple, despite the surroundings. He studied plants and flowers in the gardens. He drove through the countryside admiring wheat fields. He played golf and spent time with family members who visited. Sunday gatherings often included his adult children and their families, though the sheer size of the estate meant that even when together they remained physically separated. The 250-acre inner compound, called the Park, contained the main mansion and several additional residences. Family members could live on the property without actually living together. As a devout Baptist, Senior refused to serve alcohol at gatherings, even in an era when prohibition was law. His religious convictions had shaped his philanthropy and now shaped his final years. He continued to give away his fortune, establishing foundations and endowments that distributed money long after his death. By the time the Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil in 1911, forcing the company into 34 separate entities, Senior had largely removed himself from business operations. The breakup, perversely, doubled his wealth. The separate companies grew faster than the monopoly had. There was a witticism about the estate that circulated among those who knew it. Kykuit, they said, was what God would have built if only he had the money. But money could not deliver peace. Senior had wanted isolation from the critics and prosecutors who had pursued him for decades. He had wanted to watch his grandchildren grow up in safety. He had built gardens that cost more than the house, imported vegetation from 3 continents, and created a sanctuary on a hilltop overlooking the Hudson. He discovered that wealth insulates but does not protect. The world he had fled still existed beyond the property lines. The pressures he had escaped still existed within his own mind. John D Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at his home in Ormond Beach, Florida. He was 97 years old, 3 years short of his goal to live to 100. His fortune at death was estimated at $1.4 billion, while the total national gross domestic product was $92 billion. He had given away more than $500 million during his lifetime. His estate totaled only $26 million when the accounting was finished. He had succeeded in distributing his avalanche of wealth before it crushed his children. The mansion survived him. The peace he sought there did not. Chapter 6. The 5 Brothers. When Junior inherited Kykuit in 1937, he and Abby moved into the main house from their nearby residence, Abaton Lodge. The estate had been Senior's domain. It became a training ground for the next generation. Junior and Abby's 6 children, Babs, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, were already adults with distinct personalities and diverging ambitions. The 5 brothers, in particular, transformed the Rockefeller name from a symbol of monopoly capitalism into a network of political and philanthropic power. In 1940, the brothers established the Rockefeller Brothers Fund to coordinate their charitable giving and amplify their influence. The creation of the fund represented both unity and acknowledgement of separation. Each brother pursued his own path. The fund was the institution that kept them connected. John III focused on Asia and philanthropy. He had none of his brother's taste for public attention and preferred working behind the scenes to establish cultural exchanges and development programs. Lawrence became a venture capitalist and conservationist, funding early technology companies while preserving wilderness areas. Winthrop moved to Arkansas, where he eventually became governor, breaking the state's segregationist political machine. David joined Chase Manhattan Bank and rose to chairman, becoming one of the most influential bankers in the world. And Nelson, the 3rd son, pursued politics and art with an ambition that dwarfed his brother's accomplishments. Nelson had been his mother's favorite. He shared her love of modern art and her gregarious personality. Unlike his father, Nelson always seemed to be in a hurry. He graduated from Dartmouth and married within days. He plunged into the Rockefeller Center project, handling relations with artists and finding tenants for the complex. He built housing, schools, hospitals, roads, and monuments. He established a state university system and a modern highway network. He spent with borrowed money when his own resources proved insufficient. His style was activist, ambitious, and unapologetically grand. The brothers understood that Kykuit could not house all of them. When Junior died on May 11, 1960 in Tucson, Arizona, at age 86, they made a practical decision. Nelson had been elected governor of New York in 1958 and seemed destined for higher office. He needed Kykuit more than the others. He was the public face of the family. He should have the family's most visible residence. The brothers turned the estate over to Nelson. They could not have known how he would transform it. But first came a loss that haunts the family still, a tragedy that began 7 months after Nelson took control. Chapter 7. The Art Collector's Obsession. Nelson Rockefeller assumed ownership of Kykuit in 1961 with a vision that his grandfather never imagined. He did not want a refuge, he wanted a showcase. The basement passages that had been designed for service access became art galleries. The classical gardens displayed modern sculpture. The hilltop fortress transformed into a semi-public museum for a collection worth tens of millions of dollars. Nelson had inherited his mother's passion for modern art. While governor of New York, he commissioned works for the Empire State Plaza in Albany, creating one of the nation's largest public art collections. He served as trustee and later president of the Museum of Modern Art, which his mother had helped found in 1929. He understood art not merely as decoration, but as a statement of power and sophistication. At Kykuit, he made that statement permanent. In the early 1960s, Nelson converted the previously underutilized basement passages into a series of dedicated galleries. The underground spaces now hold more than 100 works of 20th century art. Paintings, prints, sculptures, and tapestries by Alexander Calder, Pablo Picasso, Andy Warhol, and Robert Motherwell fill rooms that had been designed for storing provisions. The collection represents millions of dollars in value and decades of acquisition. It also represents a fundamental shift in how the Rockefellers presented themselves. Where Sr. had hidden wealth, Nelson displayed it. The gardens underwent an equally dramatic transformation. Between the mid-1930s and the late 1970s, Nelson added more than 70 works of large-scale modern sculpture to the grounds. Henry Moore, Aristide Maillol, Louise Nevelson, David Smith, Brancusi, Arp, Giacometti, and Picasso. The collection reads like a catalog of 20th century masters. Nelson possessed a keen eye for placement. Each sculpture was positioned to complement the classical formality of Bosworth's gardens, while creating stunning visual dialogues. The terrace overlooking the Hudson became an outdoor gallery where modernism confronted history. The transformation elevated Kykuit from a beautiful estate to an extraordinary fusion of architecture, horticulture, and art. Visitors who later toured the property struggled to reconcile the classical exterior with the modern holdings inside. That tension was exactly Nelson's intention. He was not his grandfather. He refused to hide. Nelson's political career flourished during these years. He served 4 terms as governor of New York from 1959 to 1973, implementing liberal policies on civil rights, education, and environmental protection that put him at odds with the Republican Party's rightward shift. He sought the presidential nomination in 1960 and again in 1964, losing first to Richard Nixon and then to Barry Goldwater. The defeat stung, but Nelson continued to accumulate power through other means. In 1963, Nelson divorced his first wife, Mary Todd Hunter Clark, after 31 years of marriage. He married Margaretta Fitler Murphy, called Happy, the same year. The marriage cost him politically. Happy had divorced her own husband to marry Nelson, but he never apologized for choosing personal happiness over public approval. He and Happy had 2 sons, Nelson Jr. and Mark, whom they raised at Kykuit. The boys grew up surrounded by Picassos and Calders, in a house where art and power were indistinguishable. But even as Nelson filled the house with art and guests and political strategy sessions, certain shadows refused to leave. The darkest had arrived the same year he took ownership, and it never departed. Chapter 8. The Vanishing. In November 1961, Michael Clark Rockefeller stood on the deck of a catamaran off the coast of New Guinea and made a decision that ended his life. He was 23 years old, the youngest son of Nelson and Mary, and he had spent the previous months collecting art from the Asmat people in one of the most remote regions on Earth. The boat had capsized. He and the Dutch anthropologist René Wassing clung to the overturned hull 12 miles from shore. 2 local guides had already swum for help, but nearly a day had passed with no rescue. Michael turned to Wassing and spoke his final words. "I think I can make it." He fashioned a life preserver from two empty gasoline cans tied together with his belt and began swimming toward the coast through waters known to contain sharks and crocodiles. Wassing watched him disappear into the distance. Neither Wassing nor anyone else saw Michael Rockefeller again. Michael had graduated from Harvard University in 1960. Unlike many who inherited the Rockefeller name, he had no interest in business or politics. He wanted to do something that had never been done before, something that established his identity, apart from his family's fortune. In 1961, he joined a Harvard Peabody Museum expedition to the Balium Valley in Dutch New Guinea to study tribes largely untouched by Western contact. He worked as a sound recordist and photographer, and the experience transformed him. He became fascinated by the Asmat people of the coastal region, whose intricate wood carvings and towering ritual poles represented to Michael a kind of artistic purity the modern world had lost. He returned to New Guinea in September 1961 with Wassing. The purpose was to collect art for the Museum of Primitive Art, of which Michael was a trustee. The museum had been founded by his father. For nearly 2 months they traveled between coastal villages, acquiring shields, preserved human heads, and bish poles, ancestor sculptures that could reach 20 feet in height. Michael brought enormous quantities of tobacco, cloth, knives, and machetes to trade. Money meant nothing in the Asmat region. Objects meant everything. The Asmat people tolerated Michael's presence, but did not welcome it. Dutch colonial officials and missionaries had been in the area for about a decade, but many villages had never seen a white person. Some Asmat regarded pale-skinned outsiders as supernatural beings. Michael's aggressive collecting disrupted local economies and ceremonies. One Dutch district officer reported that Michael's presence led to a huge increase in demand for preserved heads, with one villager even requesting permission for a night of headhunting to meet the demand. There was also history Michael did not fully understand. In February 1958, a Dutch official named Max Lapre had led troops to the villages of Otjanep and Omadisep to curb tribal warfare. The Dutch burned homes, destroyed canoes, and confiscated weapons. When village leaders resisted, shots rang out. 5 of the most prominent men of Otjanep were killed. In Asmat belief, the spirits of the dead haunt the living until their deaths are avenged. The villagers had waited 3 years for revenge. When Michael disappeared on November 19, 1961, his father Nelson chartered a jet for $38,000 and flew to New Guinea. The Dutch and Australian governments deployed naval units, helicopters, and search boats. Asmat villagers searched the rivers in canoes. For days, the effort continued. No trace of Michael was found. He was declared legally dead in 1964. The official cause was drowning, but witnesses told a different story. In December 1961, a Dutch Catholic priest named Hubertus von Pai, who had lived in the Asmat region for years and spoke the language, traveled to Omadisep and heard from villagers that Michael had been killed. A year later, Dutch investigator Wim van de Waal reached the same conclusion and even obtained a skull that Asmat sources claimed belonged to Michael Rockefeller. The evidence was never confirmed. In 2014, journalist Carl Hoffman published the results of a 4-year investigation that included extensive interviews with Asmat elders. Multiple sources described how Michael had reached shore, been captured, killed, and consumed in a ritual meant to avenge the 1958 massacre. Michael's twin sister Mary published a memoir in 2012 maintaining that her brother drowned. The family never accepted the alternative explanation. A memorial stained glass window designed by Marc Chagall was installed at the Union Church of Pocantico Hills. The Metropolitan Museum of Art houses the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing, which contains more than 1,800 works, including pieces Michael personally collected. The wing reopened in 2025 following a multi-year renovation. The mansion contains the memorial window. The ocean may contain the truth. Neither offers comfort. Chapter 9. The Vice President's Secret. On the evening of January 26, 1979, Nelson Rockefeller collapsed in a townhouse in Manhattan. He was 70 years old, recently retired from serving as vice president under Gerald Ford and working on a book about his art collection. At least that was the story initially told. The truth was considerably more complicated. Nelson's political career had peaked in the 1970s. After 4 terms as governor of New York, He had accepted Ford's invitation to serve as vice president from 1974 to 1977. The role proved less satisfying than Nelson hoped. Domestic policy was largely controlled by Ford and Chief of Staff Donald Rumsfeld. Nelson found himself marginalized, but his time as governor had been consequential in ways that haunted his legacy. In September 1971, inmates at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York rioted and took hostages. After 4 days of standoff, Nelson authorized the National Guard to retake the prison by force. 39 people died, including 10 hostages. When President Nixon called to discuss the assault, Nelson's response was dismissive. "That's life," he said. The Attica deaths revealed a ruthlessness that coexisted with Nelson's artistic sensitivity and political liberalism. He could fund museums and order assaults. He could champion civil rights while authorizing violence. The contradictions never troubled him publicly. On January 26, 1979, at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening, Nelson suffered a heart attack. He was in his private townhouse on West 54th Street. Present with him was Megan Marshack, a 25-year-old woman who worked as his assistant and researcher. Marshack had been hired in 1976 when she was 22. Nelson had helped her financially, providing assistance to purchase and furnish a condominium several doors down from his townhouse. They had been working together on an art book, or so the initial statement claimed. When paramedics arrived, they found Rockefeller unresponsive. He was described as being in circumstances that were undeniably intimate. He was not wearing shoes. Marshack had not called emergency services immediately. Approximately 1 hour passed between the collapse and the call for help. Marshack had telephoned a friend first, television journalist Conchita Pierce, who eventually called the police. The delay was never fully explained. At 1 o'clock in the morning, family spokesman Hugh Morrow released a statement. Rockefeller, Morrow said, had suffered a heart attack at 10:15 while working in his office at Rockefeller Center. He had been found by security staff. He had been transported to Lenox Hill Hospital at 11:15 and pronounced dead at 12:20. Every detail was false. Within days, the truth emerged. Rockefeller had died at the townhouse, not at Rockefeller Center. Marshack had been present, not security guards. The timeline Morrow provided did not match police reports. When confronted with the discrepancies, Morrow claimed he had been confused by information from different sources. The family issued a brief statement. The 4 oldest Rockefeller children said they had conducted their own review and believed their father could not have been saved. They refused to consent to an autopsy. Cremation followed quickly, in keeping with family tradition. The circumstances led to immediate and widespread speculation about an adulterous relationship. Nelson was married to Happy, with whom he had 2 young sons living at Kykuit. The scandal dominated headlines. Comedian Johnny Carson could draw laughs simply by uttering the name Megan Marshack. People magazine named her one of the 25 most intriguing personalities of 1979. Marshack herself never spoke publicly about what happened. She moved to California, avoiding journalists and maintaining absolute silence for 45 years. She died on October 2, 2024, at age 70, having revealed nothing beyond a brief mention in a self-written obituary that she had worked for Rockefeller on art projects. The official cause of death was a heart attack. The actual circumstances suggested a powerful man who maintained a secret relationship and a family that attempted to control the narrative even in death. The delay before calling emergency services remained unexplained. The exact nature of Rockefeller's relationship with Marshack remained unconfirmed. One certainty remained. The former Vice President of the United States had died in intimate circumstances with a woman nearly 50 years his junior, and his family's first instinct had been to lie about it. The family that had spent a century protecting its image could not protect it from scandal. The mansion that had concealed so much family history now faced its most public exposure. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. When Nelson Rockefeller's will was read in early 1979, it contained a provision that surprised his surviving brothers. Nelson had left his 1/3 share of the Kykuit estate to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Lawrence and David, who each owned 1/3 following their father's death in 1960, had apparently not been consulted. Neither had the brothers' children. The decision was Nelson's alone. The bequest reflected Nelson's understanding that the Rockefeller dynasty could not maintain Kykuit indefinitely as a private residence. The costs were enormous. The gardens required constant maintenance. The art collection needed security and climate control. The infrastructure, roads, buildings, wells, electrical systems, demanded regular investment. Even for a family worth billions, the burden was unsustainable. More importantly, Nelson recognized that Kykuit had become historically significant. It was not simply a family home. It was a monument to American wealth and the dynasty that wealth created. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, a private nonprofit chartered by Congress in 1949, had experience managing historic properties. The trust owned dozens of sites across the country, from southern plantations to Midwestern prairie school homes. Kykuit was among its most prestigious holdings, but the transfer created complications. Nelson's will granted the trust only his one-third share. Lawrence and David still owned the rest. Negotiations between the brothers and the trust stretched through the early 1980s. The final agreement gave the trust ownership of Kykuit itself, plus 87 surrounding acres. In return, the trust surrendered to the family the remainder of Nelson's property that it had acquired through the will. Lawrence and David, through the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, established a $40 million endowment to maintain the house and property. They also eventually left their own shares to the trust. By the 1990s, the entire core estate, the 250-acre park containing the mansion and immediate grounds, was under trust ownership. In December 1991, according to the terms of Nelson's will, Kykuit was formally bestowed to the National Trust. The Rockefellers no longer owned the house their grandfather had built to escape the world. The dynasty had lost control of its throne room. Preparations for public access began immediately. In 1994, funded by David and Lawrence, the coach barn underwent renovation. The massive three-story structure, built of local stone in 1913 and 1914, was 3 times the size of the mansion itself. Its lower floor was converted into a modern conference facility for Rockefeller Brothers Fund events. The upper floor provided limited overnight accommodations. In 1995, the mansion itself was renovated by New Haven architects Herbert S. Newman and Partners. Major infrastructure changes enabled the estate to accommodate group tours. The 3rd and 4th floor staff quarters were reconfigured into guest suites. On May 21, 1995, Kykuit opened to the public for the first time. Tours were operated by Historic Hudson Valley, a nonprofit organization established by John D Rockefeller, Jr. in 1951. The irony was deliberate. Jr. had created Historic Hudson Valley to preserve sites like Washington Irving's Sunnyside and Phillipsburg Manor. Now his organization guided visitors through his own family's home. The transformation revealed something fundamental about institutional power in America. The Rockefellers had controlled Standard Oil until the government forced its dissolution. They had controlled Kykuit until maintaining that control became impossible. Loss, from another perspective, was a different kind of victory. The mansion built to protect Rockefeller privacy became a museum teaching Rockefeller history. The dynasty that had controlled its image for a century surrendered control to the public, but the surrender happened on their terms. Chapter 11. The Weight of Legacy. Visitors to Kykuit begin their journey at the Phillipsburg Manor House on Route 9 in Sleepy Hollow, New York. Shuttle vans transport them to the estate. No one drives directly to the mansion. Even in its public incarnation, Kykuit maintains control over who approaches and how. The tours offer 3 levels of access. The Selected Highlights tour lasts approximately 1.5 hours and includes the main floor, inner garden, and west terrace. The Classic tour extends to 2 hours, adding the basement art galleries, golf room, and coach barn. The Grand Tour lasts 3 hours and includes extended time in the galleries and gardens, plus access to second-floor rooms. Photography is not permitted inside the mansion. The restriction continues a century-old pattern of control over the estate's image and narrative. Guides share the approved narrative. John D Rockefeller Sr. founded Standard Oil and became the wealthiest man in history. He built Kykuit as a country retreat. His son Jr. expanded the philanthropy. His grandson Nelson transformed the estate into an art showcase. The tours emphasize beauty, cultural contribution, and preservation. They do not emphasize monopoly, massacre, or scandal. The basement galleries display Picasso and Warhol. They do not display the psychological cost of maintaining a dynasty across 4 generations. The archives of the Rockefeller family are held at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Pocantico Hills. The papers of John D Rockefeller Sr. Jr., Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Nelson, and others are available to researchers by appointment, but portions of the archives relating to living family members remain closed. From the outset, the family's wealth has been under the complete control of the male members of the dynasty. That control extended from business operations to image management to historical access. The public knows about the Rockefellers only what the Rockefellers have chosen to reveal. The story Kykuit tells through tours is a story of artistic vision and cultural preservation. The story the estate embodies is considerably darker. It begins with John D Rockefeller Sr., who built a fortune by destroying competitors and manipulating markets. The pressure of managing that fortune damaged his son psychologically. Junior's obsessive jealousy toward his wife and children created an environment where love and control were indistinguishable. The 5 brothers scattered, each seeking escape or validation through different paths. Nelson pursued political power with an ambition that culminated in the Attica bloodbath and a secret relationship that ended in scandal. Michael sought meaning beyond wealth in the jungles of New Guinea and likely died violently as a result. The weight of legacy crushed each generation differently. Senior spent his final years giving away the avalanche of money he had accumulated. Junior spent his life managing institutions designed to distribute that money responsibly. The brothers spent their lives proving they were more than their name. The pattern was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. By the time Nelson died in 1979, the family understood that Kykuit could not remain private. The burden was too great. The scrutiny was too intense. The world demanded access to the monument, yet access, even now, remains limited. The tours teach Rockefeller history. The closed archives protect Rockefeller secrets. The distinction matters. Controlling an empire proved easier than controlling what that empire meant to those who inherited it. Chapter 12. The Silence. On December 23, 2025, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund announced that tours of Kykuit were suspended for the entire year of 2026. No reason was given publicly. The suspension was presented as a simple operational decision, a necessary pause in programming that might be explained later, or perhaps not at all. For an institution that had spent more than a century controlling its narrative, the silence was characteristic. The suspension was not the first closure in Kykuit's history. On March 17, 2020, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a statewide shelter-in-place order in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Within days, historic sites across the nation suspended operations. Kykuit closed for the first time since opening in 1913. The mansion that had survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars went dark. The closure lasted 4 months. When tours resumed in July 2020, they operated at reduced capacity with health protocols that limited visitor numbers. The pandemic closure was forced by circumstances beyond the estate's control. The 2026 suspension is different. It is a choice. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which maintains and administers Kykuit under agreement with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, has decided that the public will not be allowed inside for an entire year. The decision follows a pattern that stretches back to 1893, when John D Rockefeller purchased 400 acres in Pocantico Hills. The pattern is control. Who sees the estate, when they see it, and what they learn about it has always been carefully managed. The Coach Barn continues to function as a meeting facility for Rockefeller Brothers Fund conferences. The organization hosts workshops, seminars, and retreats for staff and select nonprofit partners. Those events continue unaffected by the tour suspension. The distinction is revealing. The mansion remains accessible to the family's institutional descendants. The public is excluded. The future of public access remains unknowable. Will tours resume in 2027? Will the suspension extend further? Will the estate eventually close to the public entirely? with the national trust transfer becoming a legal formality that changes nothing about actual access. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund has not indicated its plans. Historic Hudson Valley, which operates the tours under contract, has not announced alternative programming. The silence, like so much in Rockefeller history, is strategic. The fundamental tension has never been resolved. Kykuit is owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a public institution. It is maintained and administered by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a private foundation. The arrangement creates a hybrid where public ownership does not guarantee public access. The family no longer owns the mansion legally. They control it operationally. The distinction allows them to preserve their greatest asset, the ability to determine what the world sees. In 2022, Historic Hudson Valley and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund released a short documentary titled Kykuit, The House and Gardens of the Rockefeller Family. The film provides virtual access to the mansion's interiors, grounds, and art holdings. It is beautifully produced and carefully curated. It shows exactly what the family wants shown. It reveals nothing they wish concealed. The pattern continues. The mansion still stands. Whether the public will be allowed inside again remains, like so much of Rockefeller history, carefully controlled. The estate sits on its hilltop today, exactly as it has for more than a century. The salmon pink and gray stone glows in afternoon light. The gardens still require constant maintenance. The irrigation systems still draw water from aquifers drilled deep into bedrock. The underground passages still connect rooms in patterns designed for privacy and control. The art collection still fills basement galleries where servants once stored provisions. The coach barn still houses vintage automobiles that illustrate the development of American wealth in metal and chrome. Everything is preserved. Nothing has changed, except everything has changed. The mansion built to escape the world became a museum, teaching the world what wealth meant in America. The dynasty that controlled 3% of the national economy could not control its own fate. The family that crushed competitors and built monopolies could not monopolize meaning. Standard Oil was broken into 34 companies. Kykuit was broken open to public tours. Both outcomes followed the same pattern. What was built to last forever fragmented when the cost of maintaining control exceeded the value of what was being controlled. John D Rockefeller Sr. died at 97, having given away more than $500 million. His fortune bought hospitals, universities, and medical research institutes. It also bought a mansion he barely enjoyed. John D. Rockefeller Jr. died at 86, having managed his father's legacy and created his own. His burden was psychological, and it never lifted. The five brothers scattered across politics, banking, conservation, and philanthropy. Their accomplishments were real. Their peace was not. Nelson filled Kykuit with art worth hundreds of millions and died in scandal. Michael sought authenticity in tribal cultures and likely died violently. The pattern across 4 generations is clear. Wealth provided everything except what mattered. Walk through Kykuit today, if you can, when tours resume. If they resume. You will see Picasso tapestries in underground galleries. You will see sculpture gardens overlooking the Hudson. You will see a coach barn filled with carriages that once transported the richest family in America through roads they built on land they owned. The guides will tell you about artistic vision and cultural preservation. They will mention Standard Oil briefly and move quickly past it. They will not discuss monopoly methods or crushed competitors. They will not mention the Ludlow massacre or Attica. They will acknowledge Nelson's political career and Michael's disappearance in ways that minimize discomfort. They will show you beauty and call it legacy. The building itself offers a different testimony. The underground passages speak of secrets. The self-sufficient infrastructure speaks of isolation. The gardens that cost more than the house speak of display, masking desperation. The mansion positioned on the highest point in Pocantico Hills speaks of surveillance. The family that built Kykuit wanted to see everything and be seen by no one. They succeeded for a century. Now tourists photograph the pink stone and modern sculpture without understanding what they document. Kykuit, where America's first billionaire built a fortress against the world he had conquered. where 4 generations learned that wealth insulates but does not protect, where underground galleries hide art that cannot hide history, where gardens bloom through seasons while the family that planted them scatters into memory, where tours will resume someday, probably, unless they do not. Still standing, still controlled,